many people looking at the modern Labour Party, today's Labour Party, Ed Miliband's Labour Party, say that it looks very much like it's reverting to a kind of statist perspective. This does seem to be a project which views almost every problem that the state needs to solve through more regulation, through more spending, through extending its reach in various ways. Are you concerned that there is a kind of resurgent statism, but perhaps it never left in the modern Labour project?
Yes, I'm very concerned. I think it's a tragedy. I don't think your characterisation of Ed Miliband is entirely fair, but I think that is the dominant sound, the dominant part of the music, as it were, that comes out of the Labour Party, certainly. And it's essentially changing society from the top down. And it's based on the belief that social change can only be procured by a strong state, strongly governed state, which produces a programme, presents it to the electorate, wins an election on that basis, and then carries it out. I mean, the paradigm of this, of course, was the Attlee government from 1945 to 51. And that is a sort of myth about the Attlee government, which has remained somehow floating around in the psyche of the Labour Party ever since. Of course, none of the other Labour governments that we've had in this country have been remotely as successful as the Attlee government. But that doesn't matter. It's somehow the attitude, well, you know, we tried, we perhaps didn't do as well as Attlee did, but that's the right course to follow. I think that's still there in the DNA of the Labour Party. Well, I think the Attlee government, I'm a great fan of the Attlee government. I grew up under the Attlee government. If people talked about Thatcher's children, well, I'm one of Attlee's children in that sense. But those days have gone. In a way, the Attlee government had a clean slate. And the changes that subsequent Labour governments have tried to carry out are far more complicated in a way. It's not that difficult to nationalise basic industries, to set up the National Health Service, and so on. It involved a lot of very hard work and courageous battles, but it wasn't, so to speak, intellectually, conceptually difficult. Whereas the problems confronted by the Wilson government in the 60s and 70s, and the Blair-Brown regime in the 1990s and the early noughties, were very difficult. And I think there was a kind of gap between perception and reality.
One last question for me before I open it up to the floor. One of the things that seems to be missing from the book is that something has happened in the last 10 years which we didn't expect to happen. So if you were been sitting here 10 or 15 years ago, we'd assumed that crime would carry on rising, that other certain kind of social pathologies, different kind of things would, the young people would drink more, be taking more drugs, there'd be a continual rise in teenage pregnancy, etc. But in fact, what some people call the social recession seems to have reversed. Crime is down, violent crime is down, young people are drinking less, taking fewer drugs, teenage pregnancy levels are down. Now, what do you think that's about? Is it society correcting itself? Is it, as it were, people may not understand your ideas, but in a sense, is society recognising that path of what you describe as the trinity of individualism, freedom and choice has come to the end of the road? Or is it just a blip?
I don't know. I mean, maybe it is a blip, but I recognise it, and it's a pretty big blip if it's a blip. I think probably, yes, you're right. It is a sort of, I'm a great fan, as you'll see if I can persuade you to buy and read the book, or you can read it even if you don't buy it. What I want you to do is read it. You'll see that I'm a great fan of the Hungarian thinker Karl Polanyi. And Polanyi believed that the story of the 19th century was really a story of a very assertive state imposing laissez-faire on a much older society in a very ruthless kind of way. Right? But there was a reaction against that. And the history of the 19th century is, according to him, the history of society, so to speak, reasserting itself against this prison house of laissez-faire. Now, it may be that this story is being repeated now. I mean, if you want to think of a comparison, I mean, Thatcher is the equivalent, if you look at it in that perspective, Thatcher is the equivalent of the harsh, repressive state of the early 19th century imposing laissez-faire on the population. And what's happening now may be the 21st century equivalent of what happened, according to Polanyi, in the second half of the 19th century. It could be. But it's still the case that inequality in this country is still the highest of the developed countries of Europe. And many of the pathologies...
But it's not as if we're not talking about it.
It's not as though we're not talking about it, but we're not doing much about it. And it's not very easy to do anything about it anyway.
I guess the point is, though, that 15 years ago it was okay to say inequality was... You didn't even talk about it, that it was a dead concept. Whereas now people across the political spectrum, well, they'll argue about the best response to inequality, but they won't argue that inequality doesn't matter or that it isn't there.
I wonder. I'm not so sure about that. I think it is... I mean, in this respect, our criticism of the Labour Party of Ed Miliband needs to be tempered, because he clearly does recognise this. He hasn't discovered the way to solve the problem, but all of this rather complicated stuff about pre-distribution is his attempt to tackle that problem, which shows that he does recognise it, I think. And of course Obama recognises it in the much more inegalitarian society of the United States. I'm not so sure that I see very much sign of it on the political right in this country, though.
Well, that's a good point to open up to the floor. Maybe there'll be people from the political right who can joust with you on that particular topic. So let's open it up to the room. There are people writing notes to me in the front. So ask a question while I read the note. Very good. Yes.
If they can stand up.
If you could stand up and shout when you speak, because we've got the microphones. No, actually, you know, I'm going to walk. I'm going to be the mic. I've done this before. I'm going to be the mic person. First time I've ever done this. So exciting. There we are. Say your name and fire away.
Good afternoon. My name is Ivor Hopkins. Given that our political situation is probably broken, is the time right for a benign dictatorship?
Apparently this isn't working, so the whole thing's a total farce. Anyway, over to you, David.
I think the trouble with benign dictatorships is they don't stay benign very long. No, I'm afraid I think the nearest thing we had to a benign dictatorship, I suppose, was in World War II, and that was pretty benign. There were some revolts against it, you know, when Churchill was Prime Minister. But still, that was a very exceptional situation where a united country was fighting for its life and fighting for a cause too, the destruction of Nazism. But no, I think the vision of benign dictatorship, you know, it's a tragedy. Think of the Middle East, think of the Arab Spring and what's happened, what we're now seeing in Egypt. It's not benign. It doesn't stay benign. The danger is more the other way around, that formerly democratic regimes are led by what I call charismatic populists who almost like to think, I don't think they put it in these words, but are in a way trying to be benign dictators. And they, in the end, it all ends in horrible disillusionment and mess. So, no, not a benign dictatorship, please.
But I guess, David, that links into the question of the possibility of democratic reform. That, you know, if the choice was really between the American federal democratic system and the Chinese governmental system, I think a lot of people would say, well, at least in China, you know, they kind of stick to things for a few years and there's rationality, even if it's in the interest of the party bosses, whereas America just feels like a profoundly dysfunctional and broken system. So, doesn't part of this story, which I don't think you touched on that. We do touch on in the book, but is about the possibility of reviving our democratic spirit. But there doesn't seem to be much sign of that at the moment.
Well, I'm not so sure. In the last chapter of the book, I have a section which I call slightly, you can see that I'm not quite sure of myself, intimations of a challenge, I call it. And I mention a series of the Green Movement, particularly this marvellous, charismatic lady, Polly Higgins, who campaigns for what she calls a law of ecocide. Ecocide being destruction of natural systems to such a point that the security of the population is endangered. And she wants to have a law making ecocide illegal. This is an astonishingly interesting proposal, I think. It's not properly worked out how it would happen and so on. That remains to be discussed. But the Green Movement is an example, I think, of a grassroots welling up of a desire for profound change. I think an organisation called Compass, which I have to admit I belong to, so I should declare an interest, is an example of another kind of grassroots organisation which is trying to push us on a different course. I think the Occupy movement was an example of that too. And this for UK citizens and London citizens, this sort of branch of UK citizens campaigning for a living wage. These are all, I think, these are all movements for change which are, in a way, which are bypassing the channels of conventional parties and conventional policy making. They may fizzle out. Nothing may come of it. But I think these are very hopeful signs of what our society is now like. And we should be trying, so to speak, to nurture these, and maybe, when it's appropriate, be a critical friend to these, but certainly not to brush them under the carpet. And one of the most depressing things, I think, here I do agree with you about your critique of Miliband and the Labour Party, they don't seem, to me, really to have taken on board that this is happening. And if they really want to change society, not by decree from the centre, but from the bottom up, this is who they should be talking to, and this is who they should be, whose insights they should be drawing upon. But anyway, in that way, I'm really quite optimistic.
Okay, let's take the lady at the back of the room. She had to shout out.
Sorry, my name's Jenny. I actually run one of the organisations we've just been talking about, which is mainly run by young people. So I just wanted to pick up on Matthew's question about is this a blip with young people becoming quite moral in their outlooks. And if you look at the figures, there are many more young people joining those sorts of societies, volunteering, being active, but they are really disillusioned